Welcome back to the Mystery School. Lovely to have you back with me again. In today's video, I'll be exploring the theme of living mythically. And I have to say I'm quite excited about this theme. It is one of my favourite themes. It's actually also the third phase of the foundational training of the Mystery School as well. So in fact, while just mentioning that, just so you can see the pathway of the themes and the curriculum of the Mystery School, I'm just going to bring up that slide again that you would have seen at the beginning of the vibration video, just so you can see the perspective of what I'm creating as part of the curriculum. That's all leading to serve you to go on your own transformative journey to transform into your greatness. So having seen that, what does it mean to live mythically? And it's such a great question, if I do say so myself. And particularly since I'm shooting this video in December, and December is when we celebrate the myth of Christmas. And I think it's such a great myth to celebrate, particularly in the Northern Hemisphere, because it's a Northern Hemisphere myth. I'll kind of explore that as a mythological concept, or the mythological story. Because that's the thing, it's like, well, what's a myth? You know, a myth is basically a story that we believe in, that we kind of create underlying structures by and live by. You know, and Christmas is a really good example of that. But also living mythically, it's about living metaphorically and symbolically, and as opposed to living rationally, where we live literally. And it's interesting because there's these two parts of us. There's these two aspects of us. There's the mythos and the logos. And the mythos is that living mythical, living from that mythical part of us, because who we really are in our essence is magical and mythical beings. But we're also human beings. We're also rational, logical beings. And that's why I love that expression, mythos and logos. And specifically, what we'll be exploring today in terms of living mythically is we're going to be exploring really the premise that everything is made up. And in particular, we're going to be exploring the premise of how your greatness created your identity, how your greatness made up your identity. And we're going to explore that in quite a lot of depth and start to explore the framework of your identity specifically. And up to now, we have explored that. We've explored how your greatness created your wound and created your beliefs, and we've explored the polarity of the beliefs and how the polarity of the beliefs create the vibration of your, the collective vibration of all the 12 core beliefs create your own unique vibration of your identity. Whereas what we'll be doing in this video is taking that one step further, where we'll be exploring in more depth how your greatness created your wound, how your greatness created your mental, emotional and physical bodies, and created your beliefs that anchored around those three bodies to create what I call the framework of your identity, and reveal that, and how that framework keeps us locked into the grey box of the pretend world, and how that framework also has convinced us through our wound and our beliefs that that's who we really are, and how it's created our persona. So very fascinating subject to explore, it really is. So in essence, what we're doing is how your mythical being created the myth of your identity. And when you actually see and we reveal how your greatness created your identity, you'll see how it really is a magnificent work of art. It's a thing of beauty. And you'll also see that it's not something that has to be resolved. Because quite often, because of the tension that the wound and the beliefs create, we assume we have to resolve it, we have to fix it, or we have to eradicate it or change it in some way. But you'll see that once you see the purpose of creating this magnificent framework, that the end result then isn't to try to fix your identity, but to use it as a launch pad to transform into greatness. So that's what we'll be exploring today. Wonderful subject to explore. So I'm going to share my screen with you again. And as you know, I love wrapping everything I do around the hero's journey and the heroine's journey framework because it just has such integrity to it. So you should see a blank screen at the moment. And as you know, if you've watched my videos up to now, and even if you don't, you'll be introduced to it. The hero's journey and the heroine's journey starts when we're born of royalty. And again, this is symbolic, it's metaphoric, it's not literal. Not many of us are actually being born into a royal family, but it's symbolic of our greatness. It's symbolic of our divinity. It's symbolic of the fact that we are divine, magical, mythical beings. And this is why I love the Christmas myth as well, because the Christ child being born is symbolic of our own royalty and the fact that Jesus is the Son of God, but then so are we. We're the sons and daughters of the divine being because we are divine. And I love the myth of that in terms of the story that's been made up. Because if you go back to the star that is above the Christmas star, the Star of Bethlehem, and how that points to where the Christ is being born. Well, this time of the year in the Northern Hemisphere, that star, the Christmas star, is Sirius. And on the 25th of December, it points to where the sun rises in the east. So it's symbolic of the rising of the sun, because in antiquity, around the summer, the winter solstice, it was perceived that the sun wasn't rising for 3 days. They couldn't see it. It was just below the horizon for 3 days. But then it resurrected on the 25th. And that star, is Sirius, is being pointed to by 3 other stars, and it's the 3 stars of Orion, which are also called the 3 wise men. So you can see where this mythical story has come from, which is again why I was so excited about doing this video at this time of year. And so, you know, again, it kind of goes back to the whole premise that everything's made up, and that this story has been made up based on the myth and the metaphor of the 3 stars of Orion pointing to Sirius that points to where the sun rises on the 25th of December. Very magical, which is why I use the 3 stars of Orion as part of the mystery school logo branding, so to speak. So being born of royalty, so in our greatness, we're energetic beings, and we are symbolically, we are like the sun. And that's why, if you've done any of my guided visualizations, you'll know that whenever I'm leading you into sovereignty, I always imagine that your heart is the sun. Imagine the rays of light are your love and your will, forming this beautiful golden circle that's your sovereign circle, because in our essence, we're energetic beings, and we're kind of aligning ourselves with that, with our imagination, when we imagine our heart is the sun. And what we wanted to do, in our true essence, we're energetic beings. We wanted to individuate. We wanted to create our own heaven on earth. And to do that, we needed to have a physical, mental, and emotional body within which we can infuse our energetic body. And so I'm going to elaborate more on how we actually did that. And it starts by actually creating the wound. And in Hero's Journey terms, the wound is the threat to life. And you may recall me talking previously, I'm pretty sure it was in the vibration video, where it's symbolic of being born in the Garden of Eden. Being born of royalty is also, because it's a really good creation myth, where Adam and Eve are symbolic of our masculine and feminine energies that are within us, the yang and the yin within us. and wanting to have an individual experience of our greatness, because we're connected to everything through love, aren't we, in the Garden of Eden? We ate from the tree of polarity, but that was also when we were wounded. And as a result, we form beliefs. And the way that we were actually wounded was as a result of seeking 100% love from your mother of your greatness and your divinity. You wanted your mum to love your divinity 100%, and you wanted your father to see your greatness and orientate your greatness in the world 100%. And that's actually how we created our wound. And as a result of not getting that 100% love and 100% orientation, it really hurts. And we were wounded as a result. And we formed these beliefs and assumptions to compensate for the pain of the wound. And for instance, if you didn't get 100% love, we make up that, well, it must be because I'm unlovable. Or if you didn't get 100% orientation, well, you make up, well, it must be because I'm not good enough. And that's why those two beliefs are the first two beliefs of the 12 core beliefs. And then as a result, we start orientating to the beliefs as opposed to our greatness and our divinity. And that's when we go into hiding and form our identity. We create this pretend self with our beliefs, and we also create a pretend world. And whatever we do, we live in struggle and survival. And so what I'm going to be going into today is exploring that in more depth. How you created your wound, how you created those three bodies. See, up to now, what we've done is in exploring the kind of mythology of eating from the tree of polarity, we've explored the fact that each of the beliefs operate according to a pendulum. And so we could drop each of those beliefs and their respective polarities into the pretend world of our identity. And that's where, as each of these pendulums swing, we create our own unique vibration of our identity. So in exploring the framework of our identity and how our greatness created it, it all comes back to the notion of sovereignty. Because, as you know, I love also calling our greatness our sovereignty. So, and as I mentioned, I love imagining our sovereignty as this golden circle, where our love and our will is at the center of who we are. And that little gold dot is like a little sun, that is your heart, and the love and the will being the center of who you are. Because when we're in our sovereignty, we're orientated to the love that's in our heart. We're orientated to the will that's in our heart. We're not looking for the love outside of us, nor are we looking for the orientation outside of us, which is like looking for the will outside of us. And so that's, in our essence, that's us born of royalty. It's another way of kind of symbolizing that we're born of royalty. And then when we're wounded, when we don't get the 100% love and we don't get the 100% orientation, what happens is that instead of orientating to the love and the will at the center of our being, we orientate to the wound at the center of our being. And that wound it's like a very dense matter. It's very intense, dense matter. I often imagine it, I like also comparing it to like the Big Bang, you know. But imagine this golden circle, because what happens when the wound is at the center, we don't operate from that golden energy anymore. We kind of operate from the lead. It is just like a piece of solid lead that's dropped into your consciousness. And imagine a trampoline surface, and imagine a bowling ball, a very big bowling ball or cannonball is placed in the center of that trampoline. And then it creates this indent. It'll create this indent. And that's actually what happens is that the wound has mass and it creates this indent in your consciousness, so in your subconscious mind. And it's really intense. It's also like the Big Bang. I think I may have just mentioned that. But it has mass. It has, and it grounds us in time and space. And what happens as a result of experiencing this intense pain, simultaneously we experience anger, fear, and depression. They kind of come out at once from that intense pain. And so we experience these three intense emotions. And what happens is each of these emotions anchor us into the physical, mental and emotional bodies. The anger anchors us to the physical body. The fear anchors us to the mental body. And the depression anchors us to the emotional body. And so suddenly we have these three intense emotions, and we also have these three bodies that the wound has anchored ourselves to. And what we then do is orientate to these three bodies as a way of escaping the intensity of the wound. Or if you imagine that the wound is creating this impression, it is like a black hole in our consciousness, which is it's like the black hole in the center of our galaxy. And so we have to avoid the wound at all costs. Like if you've seen Interstellar, for instance, you avoid black holes at all costs because they suck life into them. And in our consciousness, the wound is like that. And so what we do is we have to anchor ourselves to the physical, mental and emotional bodies so that we don't get pulled back into the vibration of the wound. And in other words, we can kind of represent that by this triangle. And I like to call this the health and safety triangle of the identity and of the physical, mental and emotional bodies. And so imagine that this is like a rail, and imagine looking down at the rail into the depths of this abyss. That's really kind of what the structure is. And so obviously we don't want to fall into the abyss of the wound. And so what we do in forming the beliefs is that in creating the wound, we have this intense experience of these emotions. We get anchored into the three bodies. And what helps lock us into these three emotions and these three bodies are the 12 core beliefs that we form simultaneously. And so the beliefs that actually anchor us to the physical body, actually before I go into the beliefs, what actually happens is as soon as we experience these intense emotions, because they're so intense, we then deny them. And each of these dots kind of represent that kind of instant denial of those intense emotions. And so there's certain beliefs that help us to serve us to deny that intense emotion. And so the beliefs that we form to help us deny the intense emotion of anger are both the not allowed to be capable belief and the powerlessness belief. And the beliefs that we formed to help us deny the intense emotion of fear is the trust belief, I don't trust myself, others, and the world, and also the insignificant belief. And the belief that we use to deny the depression, that intense emotion, is the not good enough belief. And so these beliefs then help lock us into those 3 points and keep us away from falling into the abyss of the wound. Another way of putting it is that imagine that wound is the top of the pendulum and the belief is the bottom of the pendulum, and so it keeps us down here away from the top of the pendulum, which is what we're avoiding. So essentially, I'm not going to represent it diagrammatically because it just gets too busy, but each of those points is a pendulum swinging. So imagine, say, the not good enough belief has the pendulum of success and failure swinging at that point. The trust belief has the pendulum of safety and and being unsafe, as well as the insignificant belief swinging at that point, and likewise with the not allowed to be capable powerlessness beliefs. So what happens then, because the wound is so intense when we experience it, not only do we deny the intense emotions that we experience, we also internalize them and externalize them. And we use the beliefs to do that. So there are certain beliefs that we use to internalize the intense emotions, and there's certain beliefs we use to externalize the intense emotions. And they're represented by black dots as well. Excuse me, just take a sip of my tea. And my wonderful Sunflowers Van Gogh mug. I love that mug. Anyway, so the dot on the left of your screen is kind of symbolizing the fact that we internalize the emotion, and then one on the right is where we externalize. And so the belief we use to internalize anger is the powerlessness belief on its own, and the belief or the beliefs that we use to externalize anger are the perfection belief and there is a right way belief. And then likewise, if we move over to fear, the belief that we use to internalize fear is the control belief. And the beliefs that we use to externalize fear are the capacity beliefs and there is a way the world is belief. And then if we move over to depression, the belief we use to internalize depression is the worth belief, I'm not worthy, or I'm unlovable, it's the same belief. And the belief we use to externalize depression is the not belonging belief. So where I've kind of brought these up sequentially, it all happens, like I said, like a big bang, it all happens in one movement, so to speak. And so what happens then is that as well as having these intense emotions and then denying them, internalizing them, externalizing them with the beliefs, what happens is that the beliefs start creating tension in our consciousness. And the beliefs, when they create tension, that tension has to be resolved. And up to now we know that when a belief creates tension, the pendulum starts swinging, and that pendulum swing represents, and we resolve that tension by going into one of more of the behaviours of the beliefs, and then that generates thoughts and feelings. And that's also represented within this structure. So that what happens is that when a belief gets triggered, say the trust belief gets triggered down in the bottom left-hand corner, what happens is that creates tension which has to be resolved. So while that pendulum is swinging, that tension gets resolved along this line of consciousness, because it's like little grooves of consciousness that we form in our subconscious mind. And so what happens then is as the trust belief pendulum starts swinging and the energy starts moving along that line of consciousness, kind of represented by an arrow, it will then always trigger the not good enough belief and then cause the pendulum of the not good enough belief to swing. Likewise, the insignificant belief can do that as well. If its pendulum starts swinging, it will also cause the energy, if you will, to move along that line of consciousness. And then flowing on from that, when the not good enough belief gets triggered and its pendulum starts swinging between success and failure, the tension then gets resolved. We then engage the behaviours to then, which then triggers the not allowed to be capable belief and the powerlessness belief. So the energy starts moving along this line of consciousness, causing these pendulums to swing. And then that creates tension. And then when that tension gets resolved along this line of consciousness to then trigger the trust and insignificant belief. And so what happens is that I call this the Bermuda Triangle of the identity, where as these beliefs get triggered, we kind of get locked into that kind of framework of consciousness, so to speak, where we actually think we're making choices, but it's actually just the beliefs being triggered, triggering behaviours and triggering certain thoughts and feelings. Because obviously, as the not good enough beliefs getting triggered, it's going to be triggering depression. And as even though you're denying it, and as the powerlessness belief and the not allowed to be capable beliefs getting triggered, that's going to cause emotions of anger and related thoughts. And likewise, when the trust belief gets triggered, it's going to create fear and related thoughts. So it's the same with the other dots, and it's amazing because what I love about this, you start to see this structure forming. You start to see this framework, as I like to call it, the framework of the identity, and it has such integrity, and it's amazing how it works. So in that, whenever the trust belief gets triggered, it will always trigger the not good enough belief. And when the not good enough belief gets triggered, it will always trigger the not allowed to be capable belief, for instance. And this is all happening within, in your subconscious mind, beneath your awareness, because we're only ever aware of our thoughts and feelings. And so in revealing this, I liken it to, it's like revealing Atlantis, it's just like bringing Atlantis to the surface, so with this dynamic that's playing out. It's brilliant how it works. So there's a direct relationship with the other beliefs as well. So there's this kind of Bermuda Triangle, which is like the center of this framework, and then there's another framework that goes on around it as well. And so the way that works is if we start with the unlovable belief, there's a line of consciousness between the unlovable belief and the powerlessness belief. And so when that belief gets triggered, the energy gets resolved along this line to trigger the powerlessness belief. And then when the powerlessness belief gets triggered, the tension gets resolved along this line of consciousness to trigger the control belief. And when the control belief gets triggered, the energy, so to speak, or the behaviors start traveling along this line of consciousness to trigger the capacity belief and there is a way the world is belief. And then when these two beliefs get triggered and their pendulum starts swinging, the energy starts moving along this line of consciousness to trigger the perfection and there is a way belief, there is a right way belief. And when these two beliefs get triggered and their pendulum starts swinging, then the tension gets resolved along this line of consciousness to trigger the not belonging belief. And then finally, when the not belonging belief gets triggered and that pendulum starts swinging, it will then go along this line of consciousness to trigger the unlovable belief. And so then now this then forms what I call the framework of our identity. For thousands of years, this framework has been called the Enneagram, which was first kind of developed or unfolded or revealed over 4,000 years ago in Sumeria. So it's such a wonderful representation of the identity. And the reason it's called the Enneagram is because Ennea is Greek for 9 points, or 9, and gram is like a diagram. And so you can see that the 12 core beliefs have kind of been distilled into 9 points of the Enneagram. There are 9 black dots around the perimeter of that circle of your identity. And so basically we can put a number next to each of those circles. And the way the Enneagram works, it always starts with number 2. It doesn't start with number 1. To me, that's one of the greatest mysteries is why does the Enneagram start with 2? Why did they decide to start with 2? I have a theory as to why they didn't start with number 1. They actually end with 1. And I'll share that with you in a moment, but it's absolutely my own theory, not a premise in any way, shape or form. And the 2 begins here at the unlovable belief. So this is where the numbers start, here at the unlovable belief. So anyone, in Enneagram terms, anyone who's kind of creates a persona, because this is what happens, is that we build a persona around our beliefs. And anyone who has the persona of created by the unlovable belief, in Enneagram terms, is called a 2. And then it goes clockwise. The numbering goes clockwise. So then the not good enough belief is the 3, and then the not belonging belief is the 4. And the 2, the 3, and the 4 kind of are the personas or the numbers of the depression-based beliefs. And that's the thing about the Enneagram, where there's 9 points, but it's kind of divided into these 3 triads, these 3 segments. The depression segment is the 2, the 3, and the 4. And then we move over to the 4, the fear triad, or the fear segment. And that's represented by the 5, the 6, and the 7. So the control belief is the 5, the trust and insignificance is the 6, capacity and there is a way, the world is 7. And then we move on to the anger-based beliefs and the anger-based triad, or segment. And the powerlessness belief on its own is the 8. The powerlessness belief, along with the not allowed to be capable belief, is the 9, and the perfection belief and there is a right way belief is the 1. So my theory as to why the 1s are last is because those beliefs are anger-based beliefs, and ones like to be right, and they like to be first. So my theory is that the Sumerians just wanted to piss the ones off. So that's my theory. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. But I bet it works, because they always like to be number one. Well, they are number one, but they've come last. The first shall be last, and the last shall be first, so to speak. Also reminds me of that other wonderful expression, the meek shall inherit the earth, as long as it's okay with everyone else. So assuming you're still with me, this is really revealing the framework of the identity, as I'm saying, but it's also revealing the pretend self of the identity, and the fact that it's all made up. But then, because of the beliefs, we convince ourselves that that's who we are. Particularly because, say if we start with the unlovable belief and the worth belief, what happens is that as that pendulum's swinging and it's resolving the tension with the corresponding behaviours, is that we keep playing out the same behaviours when that belief we form that belief, particularly in relationship to the wound, and we start orientating to that belief. And the behaviours of a two are such that because they believe that they're unlovable, and so the main behaviour is to help others and to put other people first, on the assumption that the love will come back and that they will be lovable. And so consequently, they're always helping people. And so that shows up in their persona. And so consequently, in Enneagram terms, that's what they're called. The two is called the helper, because that's what they're always doing, always helping others. And so that's the behaviour that we see, and that's the persona that we see, but it's driven by this unlovable belief. And so that's the persona of the two. And so each number has a description of their persona based on the core behaviour of that belief and how that belief resolves tension. And so if we move over to the three, we know that the not good enough belief pendulum swings between success and failure. And so the not good enough belief is always striving to achieve and striving to succeed. Most of the time they're focused on success and avoiding failure. And so because that's what their main behaviour that we see with someone with a not good enough belief, that's why the three is called the achiever, because they're constantly striving to achieve. And then we move on to the four, and the four is based on the pendulum of acceptance and rejection, usually trying to be accepted and avoiding rejection. And you might recall me saying with the not belonging belief, it's usually formed by orphans who didn't get any love or any orientation. But it's also, the not belonging belief can be the belief you orientate to when you had two very aloof parents, so they didn't display any love or orientation at all. And so as a result, when you have that not belonging belief, you crave love. Love is the air that you breathe, but it constantly eludes you. Love eludes you. And so that's the persona that fours end up creating. And so consequently, they're called the tragic romantic, where they're always kind of seeking love but hardly ever find it, or love is unrequited for them. I haven't used kind of examples of the 2, the 3, and the 4, but one great example of a 4 is Vincent. He was a classic tragic romantic. But if I can think of examples of a 2 and a 3, I think a classic example of a 2 would be Princess Diana, because she was always there helping others constantly. A good example of a 3 is his name Jordan Buffon, the Wolf of Wall Street guy. A classic 3, Wolf of Wall Street. So they're really good examples of personas. In fact, I will create another framework which goes into the numbers and the persona and kind of famous people who fit that profile. But then I also love using songs and movies that kind of within that personality. So I'll make that available very soon as well. So they're the depression-based personas and identities that we make up. And in other words, they're the myths that we live by convincing ourselves that that's who we are. And so if we move on to the fear-based beliefs, the 5, built on the control belief. What the control belief does, it really puts us in our heads. It makes us, because fear does that as well, and it makes us very mental. It's interesting if you remember the control belief moves between being sane and insane. So it really kind of orientates us to the mental body and locks us into the mental body. And so consequently, they're intellectuals, they're thinkers, they're always thinking. The whole thing about a 5 is their whole modus operandi is the body's purpose is simply to move the head from around. So consequently 5s are called the thinkers, or in French, le penseur. Einstein would be a really good example of the thinker, the kind of mental geniuses. You can also tell 5s too, because quite often I have a number of pens in their pocket here. It's amazing how people show up. Like 4s with their not belonging belief will often show up with lots of piercings and tattoos, mohawks, purple hair. They're kind of really outside of society, whereas 3s kind of show up as they're kind of like the person working in the city with suits and Armani and everything, whereas 2s, you'd often see 2s in service roles in hospitals and as doctors and charities. So it's amazing how it all comes together, the integrity of it. And so if we move on to 6, the 6 is predominantly built on the trust belief and being safe and unsafe. And the thing with the trust belief, it's they're either safe or unsafe in the presence or the absence of a dominant, violent authority. And so they have to ensure that their assumption is, the underlying assumption of the 6 of the trust belief is that they're only safe in the absence of the authority, the absence of the violent authority. And so what happens is that the trust belief actually kind of forms 2 personas in one. You get 2 for the price of 1. And it really just depends on where that person orientates themselves on the polarity. And so basically you've got the 2 personas are the terrorist and the loyalist. And so the terrorist persona is their positioning is, their strategy or their behavior is, you can only be safe if you eradicate the authority. And so that's why they're the terrorists, because they're trying to blow up the authority, the violent, dominant authority. And the loyalists aligns themselves with the authority. So they're still, they're safe by their side, so they become the lieutenant of the authority. And so, so that kind of forms the persona of the 6. So obviously anyone kind of known to be a terrorist is a 6, or anyone who kind of aligns themselves to an authority kind of within a military or within that kind of safe, unsafe structure will be a loyalist. And you can often see them shift, where one person's a loyalist and then they'll become a terrorist. So it's amazing how it works. And then if we move on to the 7, the 7 is mainly built on the capacity belief, not entirely. You get 2 different types of 7 based on which belief they orientate to, but the name of the belief, or the name of the persona, is mainly based on the behavior of the capacity belief. Excuse me. Because the capacity belief oscillates between positive and negative, and so if you come across other Enneagram books or literature, quite often the 7 can be called the optimist, because they're always trying to be positive and avoid negativity. What I like to do is I like calling them the epicure, because as well as being positive, they like to be buoyant, they like to be the life of the party, they like to be the social lubricant, make sure everyone's feeling great and everything's wonderful. And so that's what the epicure means, and that's why I like the whole notion of the epicure. You could also, a 7 that's built on the is the way the world is belief, if I was to call that person, I would call them the evangelist, because sevens also like to convert people into their way of thinking. So, or the missionary, but I think evangelist is probably better. So the epicure, the evangelist, depending on whether that person's persona is built on the capacity or there is a way belief. And so if we, seven, a classic seven, if we go to sixes, John Lennon was a classic six. It's interesting because sixes often get assassinated, which is a fascinating dynamic. In fact, because my persona is built around the six as well, and most of my life growing up, I just assumed that I'd get assassinated. And all my heroes were people who got assassinated. You know, like John Lennon, like Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln. It's fascinating, isn't it? So, a famous seven, Jim, what's his name can't remember his name. Some people actually think I look a bit like him. It's just a bit of an insult. From The Truman Show. Why can't I think of his name? I'm sure you'll put his name in the comments. But that guy who was in The Truman Show. Maybe I'll flash it up or something. Maybe it's like it's too traumatic to get his name. But he's a really classic seven. Anyway, if we move on to the anger-based beliefs, the eight, the thing with eights, because they swing between the powerlessness belief, with it being powerful and powerless, they like to identify with being powerful and avoid being powerless. And so they like to put themselves into positions of power and positions of leadership. And so, because that's what they tend to do most of the time, the eights are called the boss. And they're built on that powerlessness belief. And two classic eights, they're really obvious to see. Donald Trump is a classic eight, completely persona built on the powerlessness belief, as is Putin. Vladimir Putin is a classic eight, because they also love their symbols of power and having positions of power. And being head of state, for instance, is eights kind of really aspire to that power. And when they're no longer in positions of power, they're powerless, So, I always get a bit tentative, but it's like, I hope Vladimir is not listening at the moment. So anyway, let's move on to the nine. The nine is predominantly built on the not allowed to be capable belief. And if you recall, the pendulum swing of not allowed to be capable belief is the swing between peace and conflict. And most people with this belief are focusing on peace and avoiding conflict. And the powerlessness belief is swinging as well, but they're kind of orientating more to the powerless end of the pendulum. But this belief is mainly built on the not allowed to be capable belief, because they're always trying to seek peace or to create peace or make peace. And so that's why the nine is called the peacemaker. And so then we move on to the one, which is mainly built on the perfection belief, and that's why they're called the perfectionist. So famous nines, I can't think of a famous nine at the moment, a famous one. I should have thought of some beforehand, but I'll maybe add some to the comments, or feel free to share any famous nines that you're aware of. But a classic nine, if you've Nicole Kidman's role in Moulin Rouge, so that's where sometimes I can't think of famous people, but I can think of acting roles. Like Al Pacino in Scarface is a classic eight. But can't remember her character's name, but Nicole Kidman in Moulin Rouge is a good example of a nine. And perfectionist, famous one. Can't think right now. But if you've seen, because it also shows, as well as it's showing up in individuals, it shows up in structures as well. But I'm not going to dive into that in too much depth. But if you've seen A Handmaid's Tale, the people who run Gilead are all ones. It's that whole structure is built on that there is a right way and that perfection. So that's one that immediately comes to mind. So now we have the whole framework of the identity and the personas and the identities that the beliefs create. And so what we can do then is where we've put all the polarities of the beliefs and dropped them into the grey box of the pretend world, what we can also do now is drop it into the grey box of the pretend world. And that's where the persona fits, or the framework of our identity operates. And so that's why we so identify with our identity, and that's why we're convinced that that's who we are. And so what happens then is we get locked into that, and we think it's real. And so when we think our personas are real, and that's the whole thing with the Enneagram. It's not who you really are; it's your pretend self. It's who you've made up. And so, most of the time when I start revealing the Enneagram, obviously it creates tension. You want to know what's your Enneagram number, and which is fair enough. It's a good question to ask in terms of wanting to know your identity. And typically, what people do when they start learning about the Enneagram is they'll answer questionnaires either at the back of an Enneagram book or an Enneagram website, and the questions will all be geared around just like any kind of personality profiling system, whether it be my ones I'm familiar with, the Myers-Briggs and the DIC profile. There's many of them out there, where you answer these questions, and it's kind of like a built-in algorithm that then will then kind of reveal your Enneagram number. And what I found with revealing your Enneagram number that way is that it can be somewhat accurate, but what I found over the years is that it's usually just off the mark. It doesn't quite capture who that person's identity really is. And that's because you're actually doing it within the fishbowl of the pretend world. You're using your beliefs and your thoughts and feelings to try to reveal yourself. And so typically, like a fish can't see the water it's swimming in, so you can't quite get an accurate reading, if you will, or accurate measure of your identity by using your identity to determine it. Another way I like to put it, it's like, imagine if you drop a stone in the water and you look down at the stone, that the stone isn't actually where you see it because the light's refracted through the water. It's actually just off the mark. It's the same when we see the stars at night. The stars aren't actually where we see them because the light's been refracted through the atmosphere of the earth. And it's the same with the identity. And so it's much better to determine your Enneagram number using your greatness, because your greatness is outside of the grey box of the pretend world. It's not in the same water. It's like it elevates you above the pretend world. And the way that we use our greatness is by using our imagination and intuition. So it's a much better way of doing that. And so feel free to answer the questions at the end of a book or within a website. I think it's an interesting exercise, but I would really encourage you to do it intuitively. And what I've done is create a video over on Patreon for my patrons, where I lead you through an intuitive exercise, like an intuitive framework that will reveal your Enneagram. And it's a really simple, based on the premise of what I've done in revealing the Enneagram. So if you would love to learn how to do it intuitively, become a patron of the Mystery School and reveal it intuitively. And then you'll also have access to all these other resources that I've created to serve you to live mythically and to serve you to live and create from your imagination and to transform into your royalty. So I know I've spent a lot of time revealing the framework of the identity, the Enneagram, up to this point. And so feel free to, if you want to pause the video now, but I am rather than create another video, I am going to move on from here, because this is kind of like the first part of what I wanted to go into, in that we've explored how you as a magical and mythical being created the myth of your identity. And in creating the myth of your identity, you then convince yourself that that's who you really are. And that's where I love referring to Harry Potter. Remember, like, Harry Potter's born of royalty because he's the son of a witch and a wizard. His threat to life is when Voldemort attempts to kill him, and he's got the scar on his forehead, and then he forms this identity of being a muggle in this pretend world. And while ever he's there, he's convinced that that's who he really is. In fact, because he's an orphan, he's very much created a persona around the not belonging belief. So you could, his persona as a muggle, Harry's persona is very much the tragic romantic of the four, because he really kind of has this kind of, not sure of the word, but he's always kind of craving these parents, and who are his parents, and these elusive parents, and and that's the thing with fours, is that they're always trying to discover who they are, try to define themselves. Who am I? I need to take another cup of tea. So as I was saying, there's no point trying to erase the wound, fix the beliefs, or heal the wound, change the beliefs, because anything you do, all you're doing is moving around the Enneagram, triggering one belief or another belief, triggering other pendulums to swing. But when you see that your greatness created it so that you could have a framework to infuse yourself within, it becomes a fantastic place to play now. And it also becomes a framework that you can launch yourself from. Very similar to revealing the pendulum swings. So rather than being embroiled within the quicksand of the pretend world, it literally becomes like a helipad. It almost looks a bit like a helipad. For you to launch yourself on your own unique transformative journey. And that's what I love about revealing the Enneagram and this whole energetic dynamic that's playing out. Because that's the other thing about revealing it intuitively, is that it's not a static thing. The Enneagram is not a static thing. Like that's the thing. If you just answer questions, it's quite static, and it just reveals the number. Whereas when you look at it when you look at it intuitively and reveal it intuitively, you see the energy and the dynamic that's moving around. You see how you're orientated to one number, but how you move around and how you resolve the tension. It's really quite extraordinary how it works. Actually, in that, I do actually one thing I do want to share in terms of the different flavors of the personas. I'm just going to go back again to this slide, because where you could essentially, rudimentarily, you could form 9 rows and kind of gather the billions of people on the planet and align them pretty much into these 9 rows, these 9 personas. But there are different flavors of personas as well, based on the numbers that are close to them. Often liken it to a gelato shop. It's like you don't just have 9 flavors of gelato. There's different flavors. And so it's the same with our persona and our identities. Sometimes you'll come across someone who is a classic 2 or a classic 3. But again, we don't all fit within that box. And so if we start with the 2, you'll get a different flavor of 2 if they're one. You'll have a different flavor of 2 if you've got a 2 who also has a perfection belief. And so what happens is that 2 then gets pulled into the gravitational pull of the 1. And so you'll get a slightly different persona. You'll get a persona of someone who's depression and anger based. You'll get that kind of influence of wanting to help but also wanting to be right. Likewise, you'll get a different sort of 2 when if they also have a not good enough belief. And so if you imagine the 2 and the 3 coming closer within their gravitational field. You have someone that's much more depression based, and you'll have someone who likes to help and to achieve at the same time. So again, it'll be a different flavour of the two. And in Enneagram terms, that's called the wing. The numbers on either side are the wings. So a 2 has a 1 wing and or a 3 wing, or a 3 will have a 2 wing and or a 4 wing. It's just kind of good Enneagram kind of language, so to speak. Good and bad. It is Enneagram language. And likewise, you can kind of determine your where the numbers too by where how you resolve the tension. Like a 2, when it gets tense and or reacts to something in the outer world or reacts to others, that's when they go to 8 in high stress, and it triggers a powerlessness belief. Or a 2, when they kind of retreat into themselves, quite often they will retreat to 4, because quite often when a worth belief when you retreat into yourself, it triggers the not belonging belief. And so that's another way of kind of how a 2 orientates as well in terms of moving to 8 in high stress and retreating to 4. So I just wanted to mention that as well, and I'll be kind of going to this in a lot more depth in over on Patreon in terms of how we reveal your persona with your intuition. So just progressing, the advantage of revealing this framework, it's like revealing Atlantis because it sits within our unconscious mind, is that it frees you to leave the pretend world and step into the magical world. Having access to your imagination and intuition now, because you can directly access it, and your imagination and intuition will always reveal what you love. And so when it does, that's when you purposely go on your own hero's journey or heroine's journey to bring what you love to life and to transform into your royalty. Because you're born of royalty, the end result is to live your royalty. And so that's when you purposely step into the magical world and go on your call to adventure. And you herald yourself into the magical world. And this is what I've revealed in the philosophy of the mystery school video. And so that's where I go into this in a lot of depth. But just to kind of reveal it, because that's the other great thing, is that when you can step out of the pretend world and not be embroiled in it, not just be moving around the Enneagram like a pinball machine, each of these phases of your own unique journey reveal themselves. And so you know that when you're going to go on your call to adventure, you know you're going to encounter threshold guardians, and you encounter them with your courage and conviction, because your imagination and intuition has given you access to that. And you're able to transform the threshold into that shimmering veil, and then cross the threshold to meet the wise person, both the wise person within yourself and the wise person who's there to serve you to transform into your greatness. Because when you do meet a wise person, they always reveal who you really are. They don't go, you're not a muggle, you're a wizard. You're not your identity, you're your greatness. And then it then reveals the opportunity to go into training with the wise person, to be trained in your imagination and intuition, which then becomes the anchor point where you start living in the magical world and creating and orientating to the premises that enable you to live and create from your imagination and intuition. And then you don't start identifying with your identity anymore. You start identifying with your greatness. And you do that because you can face your demons. You die to the pretend world and the identity being real, because you can see that it's all been made up and that you made it up. And that the only reason we get pulled back into the pretend world is when the beliefs get triggered and we start moving around the Enneagram structure. And then that frees us to then receive the treasure of your greatness and be resurrected by the power of love into your greatness and your royalty. And then as a result, that's when you live your royalty, when you're the master of both the magical world and the pretend world. So there it is, living mythically. And that's how our greatness, your greatness as a magical, mythical being, created your identity and created the framework of your identity. And how, in creating that framework, we then convince ourselves that that's who we really are. But the beauty of being able to see this, from my perspective, the beauty of it is that you can see that it's all made up and that your identity has been made up. And then you're not embroiled in the whole gravitational pull of the pretend world anymore. And then it frees you to start to go on your own unique transformative journey, or continue on your own transformative journey to live your royalty. So if you would love to learn how to reveal your persona and your Enneagram number intuitively, then again I invite you to join me over on Patreon, where I'll lead you through a guided visualization and an intuitive exercise that will reveal it. So thanks again for joining me today, and I look forward to sharing the next Mystery School educational video with you. Lots of love. See you again very soon. Bye for now.